from the Salvation Army National Headquarters, this is the Fight for Good podcast.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Fight for Good podcast. I'm your host, Lieutenant Colonel Tim Foley, broadcasting today from our offices at the Salvation Army National Headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia. With me today is our editorial director of the War Cry, Mr. Josh McDowell.
Greetings, Colonel. Great to be with you.
Good to be with you as well, even though you are remote and I'm sitting here in my office all by my lonesome. I miss you guys. And over there to my left or the right or behind me is our wonderful producer, Elizabeth. Hello, Elizabeth.
Hello there.
Are you remaining positive?
I am so stoked.
Well, everybody, we're really glad that you've joined us again today. We're grateful for our listeners. We're grateful for our audience. It's growing, and we're grateful for the opportunities that God has given us through our program and publications department here at National Headquarters to resource the Salvation Army in the United States and even abroad throughout the world in these days, these very, very unique days. So we hope that these few moments will be something that will lift your spirit, give you a little inspiration, and hopefully you can have a couple of chuckles or whatnot as you take home or some important thoughts today, because today we have a very, very special guest with us, Mr. Bob Hostetler, who is a prolific author, over 50 books, and used to be a long time ago on our staff here, the War Cry staff. Toured the country, continues to pump out all kinds of great things. And we have him featured with a great article in the August issue of the War Cry called How to Hear from God. Bob, welcome to the Fight for Good podcast. It's just an honor. And so we're so glad to have you here today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I'm thrilled to be a part of this, and it's a little bit of a blast from the past, since I once worked with Josh McDowell, but I promised not to tell any stories.
Get in line for that.
Yeah. But no, it's a joy. Thank you for letting me participate like this.
Well, we hope you and your family are staying safe in these kind of interesting days that we're at here. The Salvation Army, we're kind of still rolling the old chariot along and finding different ways and innovative ways to kind of make our materials available to everybody. And one of the ways that we've been doing that pretty successfully lately is through podcasting. Bob, you have written a lot. You've written specifically some items for the Salvation Army. What's perhaps one of your most favorite things that you've written either about or for the Salvation Army in your long litany of literature achievements?
Well, that's a long list, but what comes immediately to mind, some years ago, my goodness, I don't even know if it was 5 or 10 years ago, but I had the honor of collaborating with National Headquarters, National Publications, on an update and re-release of Samuel Logan Brengel's, Commissioner Brengel's books, 9 books that we did as 6 volumes, and just kind of updated some of the language and just made it a little bit more 21st century friendly, that sort of thing. But that was a labor of love. I've long been an acolyte of Brengel, and his influence on my life is immeasurable. So that was a lot of fun. It was a lot of work, but it was a lot of fun. It's the Holy Living series, I think it's called, of 6 books that published jointly by the Salvation Army National Headquarters and Wesleyan Publishing House.
It was a great series. In fact, I'm just looking and seeing it on my shelf. And I think when those books were published, I was on the staff of the Brengle Institute in Chicago, and it was just a great resource. Thanks for doing that. Also, your devotional book, is very successful. The kind of came out of that where there was little snippets of Bringle devotions. And I know I use that from time to time in my own walk. So thanks for your work on that. It was a great collaborative sort of process. In our August issue, you have this really provocative statement in this great great article called "How to Hear from God." You say God has not spun creation into motion and then walked away. In this real time of great uncertainty and even fear due to all these current events that just seem to be shifting every nanosecond, what do you see as God's will in the context for us as humanity, like going on in these days?
Oh, I've always considered that a fairly easy question to answer, since the Bible in 1 Thessalonians 4 actually says specifically what God's will for all of us is. It's, we tend to fixate and focus on specific wills. Do I take this job, or do I marry this person? But really, God's will as specified in His Word is our sanctification. And, there obviously there are a lot of things that go into that. I think our sanctification, especially in these uncertain times, as you put it, consists, as it always has, of love. Jesus, when asked what the greatest commandment was, he came out with two. The first and greatest commandment, love the Lord your God, and the second commandment, like to it, is love your neighbor as yourself. And I think focusing on those two things, loving God, loving others, loving all others, is what contributes to our sanctification in these times as in any time.
Quick question, Bob. Just so we're clear, could you give us a definition or an idea of what sanctification means?
Well, I think it's that we could get into the theological bushes here, but I think the easiest way to understand our sanctification is our unique set apartness for God. That sanctification, holiness, set apartness means that we belong to Him and are under His influence. And I think the thing that most brings us under His influence after the new birth is that life of love. When we live in love for God and for all, then I think we are being sanctified, being developed in our spirits in the way that God wants.
Interesting. I mean, so in your article that's in the August issue of the Workright, you give very, clear steps for how to hear from God. And what struck me about your writing there was that you definitely make it clear that it's a two-way street, and that using young Samuel as an example. Could you just explain that a little bit further for us?
Yeah, sure. It is a two-way street, because very often, I think, I'll put it in terms of me, very often I want to hear from God. I want direction from Him on a certain subject or in a certain opportunity, and I haven't really been putting myself in His path, as I tend to put it. That is, I think hearing from God, discerning His will, is the fruit of a relationship. And I think very often I make the mistake of expecting direction, expecting guidance and God to speak to me, when I haven't been necessarily cultivating the presence of God and getting quiet before Him and being ready to listen to Him, all of which is interestingly depicted in the biblical story of First Samuel, from First Samuel. And so I think it is that two-way street is the people who let me put it this way, the times when I am hearing from God and discerning his will accurately and sometimes quickly are those times when I've put myself in his path, and I've gotten quiet. I've listened for him. I've been in his presence, and those are that's how the two-way street, or two-way relationship operates, I think.
Bob, what I really like about your article is how it flows. You've got 7 very clear points here, and when we did a podcast where we were explaining content for the August issue in the War Cry, I strongly recommend that our readers and listeners look at this article because it's just very, very clear, and it's a great Bible study on Samuel's life. But you said something in the which I really resonate, because sometimes in the Salvation Army we have a hard time stopping and really learning to listen to God. But you have this great line in your 6th point that talks about get into a listening attitude. You say, God is a gentleman. He doesn't like to interrupt, so he seldom speaks unless we are listening. That's just like boom. That goes right to the heart of the problem, doesn't it? A lot of times
That's
we just don't stop.
that's good stuff, isn't it? Yeah, but it's true. I think it's absolutely true that God, as a gentleman, takes his cues from us, as any good conversationalist does. Nobody likes someone who dominates the conversation or interrupts. God doesn't operate that way. He takes his cues from us. What a gracious thing for him, the Almighty, the Master of all, to do, to take his cues from us in conversation. And yet I think that's what he does. He doesn't interrupt. He seldom speaks unless we're listening. And so our role, if we really want to hear from him, is to get quiet, to get into a listening posture, and then he may well speak. He may well speak more than we want to hear sometimes.
Well, I'm always skeptical of the people that say, "Oh yeah, I've audibly heard from God." And I was mentioning to Jeff earlier, I think if I audibly heard from God, I would be just a pile of goo right now, because I mean, we're talking about the Almighty here. So I really like how you've kind of laid this out of the need to just put yourself in a place. And part of that doesn't obviously it means maybe physically getting in a space, but can you kind of speak to the attitude of the heart, how you get yourself to that place where you can really hear the heartbeat of God?
Yeah, this I think is part of the challenge for salvationists in particular, because one of the wonderful things historically and temperamentally about the Salvation Army is it's a very activist tradition. It's doing the most good. It's so, but that can mitigate against this listening posture, I think. And so I'll tell you a quick story. 25 years ago, maybe, I know I don't seem old enough to be citing something 25 years ago, but
Because you're only
something like that.
19, so
Exactly.
but
That's in my
we're publications. We don't have anything to do with numbers, so that's
right.
confusing.
In my head, I'm 19, but something like 24, 25 years ago, I started doing an annual, sometimes more than annual, prayer retreat at a silent monastery. And that's where I first discovered the ministry of silence in a follower of Jesus's life. And because when we are, and and in the article, I think I say early on, to get quiet. And maybe I should have said get silent, because it's in the silence when we're not taking in stimuli from the television or the radio or our iPhones or people around us or that sort of thing, but that the conversation. Oh, okay, quick story. The first time I went to this silent monastery in Kentucky, I determined I was going to pray each each time the monks went to prayer 7 times a day, I would go to prayer. And so I arrived at the monastery at about lunchtime, which is important for me because I like to eat. But I went to the first hour of prayer, the first time of prayer. They call them hours, but they're only 15 minutes or a half hour usually. And then went down to the lunch line, went through the lunch line and ate, and then went to the next 7 hours to the next day at just before lunch. I went to that time of prayer and then went down. And this is after now 24 hours in silence. There's no one talking to me and me talking to no one. And I went down to go through the lunch line and I got my food and I set my tray on the table and I folded my hands over my tray to pray, to say grace. And it was startling because I realized I was already praying. In fact, I'd been praying all morning. I'd been in a conversation with God internally in the silence. And so there was two-way communication happening, God talking to me talking to God. I didn't need to enter into prayer. And I think very often that's what, the Salvation Army isn't a contemplative tradition, it's an activist tradition. So it can be even more of a challenge, I think, for many, not all Salvationists to enter into the ministry of silence. But that is where so much of God's speaking and guidance comes from. It's not just taking 5 minutes and being quiet, it's entering into a posture, an attitude, and sometimes that takes a while to shut down all the machinery of our minds and hearts and spirits to enter into the silence. But it's there, as it was for Elijah, it's there that God often speaks in a still small voice.
Well, there are three legs to spiritual formation: the word, prayer, and reflection. I think we as Salvationists do an awfully good job with the first two, but you're right. We don't know how to stop. And actually, the latest book that we've released from Crest Books was I took my doctoral dissertation and put it in a narrative form. We call it Rest for the rest of it, and that's my whole art. Not It's kind of like my abstract, I guess, with it is, it's important for us to create space in our lives so we can hear from God and we can be energized. We rest to work, and so I thank you because you just have kind of drilled in. You've confirmed some of the things that God is currently speaking, I think, to our organization. So thanks for affirming that.
Yeah, that's you'll be interested in Colonel Foley's book, Bob. Rest for the Rest of Us, on that very topic.
Sounds great.
Yeah, yeah. So okay, so granted, individuals can learn how to access the divine, but really, for many of us, that means when we're silent, we're hearing our own drumbeat, we're hearing our own machinations. What practical things do you do to make that a reality in your life that people might benefit from knowing?
Yeah, I think it comes with practice because for me as a young man, I was so going 100 miles an hour, and especially as a young Corps officer, just going at breakneck speed all the time. And so slowing down is a part of it, finding those moments of silence. But I think also, at least as God works in me, one thing I've discovered that he's a gentleman. He's very gracious, and he often works through my machinations, as you say, through my own personality and through my tendencies and through my passions, the things I care about. And so very often I think, at least speaking only for myself, I'm too quick. I have been historically too quick to dismiss my wants, my desires, my hopes and dreams and passions as, well, that's me talking, And yeah, it is, but I think that those are the avenues, I think, that very often God uses to tweak me, to guide me. Now, clearly when I think I hear something from him that runs counter to my desires, to my passions, well, then I sit up, because that's not my natural tendency. I wouldn't necessarily go there all on my own. But 90% of the time, I think it's fair to to believe that God works through our even our moods, even our emotional temperatures to speak to us. But that only comes with practice. And I think, uh, in my youth, there was a mistrust of those things that has not entirely dissipated. But as I've gotten older, I've learned to recognize God speaking and guiding even through my desires. It and those are the times when, as I said a little briefly, I think in the article, I want to seek counsel and make sure that it's not just I want it this way, I want to have my own way instead of God's will. But um, so seeking counsel is important, especially when I sense Him guiding along lines that track with my preferences or my desires. But very often, I find that that's how He made me this way. He gave me these desires, and as the psalmist said, he gives me the desires of my heart. I think first he, through the new birth and through sanctification, he transformed the desires of my heart. But when those desires are transformed and I want more and more of him, then he works through those desires, those sanctified desires, to guide me and to show me what he wants.
We're turning a corner here pretty soon. In January, we'll celebrate 140 years of the war cry. Jeff, you've been here 120 of those years, right? I'm just trying to
I think
get
he's
my
been
math
there all
right.
of them.
Yeah,
It was
all
before
of them.
electricity. Before electricity.
And you were obviously an integral part of that for a while in your journey with the Lord in Salvation Army. Is very grateful for that and your continued support as we go along. And we're trying to do all we can to encourage new writers, and we're exploring all different kinds of way to contribute. Uh, you were probably like me. You were encouraged by somebody to just trying to get going at it. But what motivates you in this day and age right now to write as a writer?
I don't think I can not write. I think it's I don't need much motivation. I need focus. I need direction. So I was raised in a family of readers and writers, and so it's kind of woven into my personality, into the way I operate. That's just I sometimes I have to sit down at the typewriter or the keyboard to know what I think. I have to start the fingers moving, because sometimes I think through my fingertips, and so that's so the motivation for me, obviously. Okay, a quick story here.
That's fine. We got
Again,
time for quick stories. It's great.
to, uh, decades ago, a friend of mine gifted me a couple of days of consultation. He was a professional consultant and had worked with some, headliners among Christian ministry folks, and and so he wanted to help me kind of craft a Bob Hostetler ministry kind of a thing, and we butted heads for 2 days, and finally I realized that one of the reasons we were butting heads was he was trying to get me down to a focus of one message, of a key message for me. And I finally said to him in frustration, but it really crystallized some things for me. I said, look, I love God. I love God's word, and I love words. And anything that'll combine those passions, those predilections, I'm up for. And so, as a writer, those 50 some books, they're kind of all over the map. I've done, youth, I've done adults, I've done devotions, I've done fiction and nonfiction and Christian living and reference works and so on and so forth. And so I'm a bit of a generalist, which can be a challenge for a Christian writer these days, but that's because my passions are those three things. I love God, I love God's word, and I love especially the written word. And so so that's where I find my motivation, is in those things. It's partly kind of how I operate, but it's not hard for me to find motivation to write. It's harder to find focus.
Well, as a Shakespearean actor, I've been in a couple of Shakespeare plays and community theater in San Francisco recently in Hamlet.
Oh, I'm jealous.
Yeah,
I'm jealous.
So I want to check out your book, The Bard and the Bible. That just sounds fascinating to me. Thanks for taking the Bard's words and there's a lot of truth in there. So.
Well, yeah, that's part of the background of that book. That's another labor of, well, they're all labors of love. But with that one, years ago, as a Shakespeare nut and as a Bible nut, I realized that these two great towering works of English literature, the works of Shakespeare and the King James Version of the Bible, these were both created in the same period, in the same country, in the same city, by men who knew each other, right? And so I remember sitting in my 20s, I guess it was, in a Shakespeare college class on Intro to Shakespeare or something like that. And I was looking around at the other students in the class who were really struggling with the Shakespeare's language, the Elizabethan these and thous and that sort of thing. And I was puzzled by why aren't they, I'm not smarter than them, why aren't they catching this? And then it dawned on me that I was raised on the King James Version, right? And so I got it. It wasn't a challenge for me. And that's when the light began to dawn. So for me to take that, it's a 1-year devotional, The Bard and the Bible, a Shakespeare devotional, and each day take a quote from Shakespeare and a verse from the King James Version of the Bible. Sometimes because Shakespeare knew his Bible better than we do, I promise you. But sometimes one confirms the other. Sometimes they contrast, but it's amazing the parallels. Like, for example, just one, since you mentioned Hamlet, when Hamlet says, "What a piece of work is a man, how noble in faculties," right? And so on and so forth. I can't recite the whole speech. I hear echoes of the psalmist who said, "What is man that thou art mindful of him, that thou regardest him?" And each one mentions he's a little lower than the angels, And so, like I said, Shakespeare knew his Bible. That just, there's so many depths to be plumbed in the relationships between the poetry, the beauty of Shakespeare, and the beauty and poetry of the King James Version are just a joy to my heart.
Yeah, wow. Reading Shakespeare, I get the feeling that man said everything, sometimes in his writing. But I know you, Bob, to be a very disciplined person. So on a practical level, for those who are just considering writing or contributing something to the work, right, for instance, are there practical things you could give some advice on?
For someone
just starting to write.
Yeah, aspiring to write. Number one, I would say read everything, read a lot, read Colonel Foley's book, read my books, all of them, right? But
Read
because that's
Shakespeare.
yeah, read Shakespeare, read the Bible. It's all good stuff. But really, very often people, when they learn that I'm a writer and I'm also a literary agent, when they learn one or both of those things, they'll say, "Oh, I want to write," and I'll say, "Have you been to a writers' conference?" Because it's amazing to me how I present at maybe 8 or 10 writers' conferences a year, and of course, during this year of shutdowns, many have gone online, and I'm the executive editor also of ChristianWritersInstitute.com, which we call the online Christian Writers Conference, but a writers conference for somebody, whether they're brand new to this idea of writing, or whether they've written a bunch of stuff, or even have a manuscript, article or book in manuscript, the amount of knowledge that it takes, it's not hard, but it's voluminous to write for publication. And so just a couple days at a writer's conference will expand a writer's horizons in ways that I don't know any other way to get that much downloaded into your brain that quickly. And so and then the third thing I would say, whether you do a writers conference or not, just start showing it to people, sharing it with people. Write for your core newsletter. Send your stuff into the War Christ. Try to submit and to take whatever encouragement, whatever feedback, whatever critique comes your way. Don't own the words, own the mission. Is something that I often say to people. You want to get a message across, and if somebody says it's not coming across, well, that could be the voice of God, to go back to what we were talking about earlier. So those would be my main pieces of advice to someone who wants to write for publication.
So I have to ask you, Bob, as a man of letters, and there's so much we could talk about in this regard, how would you describe the current landscape of Christian publishing, and how would you like to see it improve?
Well, that's a loaded question, isn't it?
It
And now
is.
I'm not a prophet. I'm not a prognosticator. My boss as an agent, Steve Lobby, is probably the most informed of anyone I know in terms of seeing the landscape, and seeing what's coming down the pike. But I'll give it my best shot to answer your question. Even with or without the COVID-19 pandemic and the accompanying shutdowns and the things that have been canceled or postponed as a result, regardless, Christian publishing is, I'm convinced, in a period of real transition in which book publishers in particular are figuring out the new landscape. They're tentative, they're being careful. They've got a mission to accomplish, and they've also got a family, employees, staff members, as well as their readers and customers to preserve, to take care of, to cultivate. And so they're being very cautious, very careful. And they should be, but with the advent of ebooks, which the ebook number of sales, that phenomenon kind of peaked 2 or 3 years ago, and I think it's reached a level now where about 16% of book sales are, at least in North America, are ebooks. It actually went close to or 20% in 2017, I think, but now it's about 16, 17%, and that seems to be pretty stable. But that was a big adjustment because by and large, Christian publishers aren't sure how to make ebooks profitable. They haven't they haven't opened that safe yet. And that's taken, now the audiobook phenomenon is blooming ballooning, mushrooming, pick your metaphor. But even with all that, a lot of Christian bookstores and chains of Christian bookstores have closed, have gone bankrupt, that sort of thing. And so the brick and mortar model is changing and transitioning. So all that to say that I think probably for the next 5 years, Christian book publishing is in a place where they're still figuring things out. The publishers I work with continue to be healthy and continue to acquire books. In fact, as an agent, I had two clients sign contracts this week, and my 2020 the clients that have signed books this year is with those two contracts now is equal to what my clients did all of last year. So it's not like they're sitting back, sitting on their hands, these publishers, but they are being very careful. So I think it's a good thing. It's going to turn out to be a good thing because in commercial, traditional Christian publishing of books, I think the cream is rising to the top once again, and the books that are going to be released in 2021 and 2022 are the best of the best. And so, but what that means is the competition is stiffer than it used to be, and that's a good thing long term. But it does mean, again, back to the previous question, that those who aspire to write for publication really need to earn their chops. They need to develop their skills, and whether it's a writers' conference or online classes or whatever it might be, critique groups, that sort of thing, like Word Weavers International, I plug them every chance I get. That's going to be even more necessary in the coming years because the market is still, for Christian publishing of books, is still healthy, but the competition is tighter than it used to be. And you'll probably hear in the coming months of this publisher or that publisher that have eliminated this line of books or are shifting their focus, but those sort of things happened before the pandemic, and they'll continue to happen after it.
Well, Bob, we really appreciate you spending some time with us today. I was wondering if you had any kind of closing thoughts or anything else that's kind of on your heart that you want to either say to our listeners, potential writers, or just a word of encouragement overall to our listeners today.
Yeah. Well, here's what comes to mind because, you folks are sitting on a gold mine from a writer's perspective. The work of the Salvation Army, that ministry that goes on day after day across the country and around the world. There's so much story, so much good in being done, and the ministry that's being accomplished is, day after day, month after month, and year after year, is largely an untold story. And so what I would encourage to at least the Salvationist listening to this podcast is start collecting those stories and writing those stories, because I know from experience from my time on staff at National Publications that it's hard to go find those stories unless somebody in the field is reporting them, is at least cultivating something of a writerly perspective on all the good that the Salvation Army is doing. And so I think really, I would love to see God raise up a new and huge army, literary army within the Salvation Army, because those stories need to be told. And of course, the War Cry and National Publications are a primary forum for that. But yeah, I'd love to see, my encouragement would be to start writing those stories, to start telling the story of the Salvation Army. And, in today's media atmosphere, it's really crucial for the Army story and all that good work to not go unnoticed.
Well, I'm going to give the last question and the last word to our editorial director, Mr. Jeff McDonald, because Jeff, I know there's a lot of stories yet to be written about your life that Mr. Hostetler is going to eventually publish. So here's your chance to defend yourself.
It'll be a small audience, unfortunately, but
Oh, I don't know. With all there's a lot there, man.
but the Verona Diner, we could talk about the Verona Diner.
Yeah, that
I mean,
stuff. Some of
geez.
it's scandalous. Some of
Some
it's
of it is.
hilarious. It's
Some
all
of it
good.
is.
Yeah.
Oh, Bob,
The problem, though, is that, and this is an old saw that writers have used for a long time, but, the problem with nonfiction is, that it has to be believable,
Oh, yeah, that's true.
and so much of your story just isn't.
Yeah. That's probably better off that way. But when you hear you speak, and about the Christian market and reading, and the competition and the media influence and people's short attention spans, I haven't heard much talk about revival lately. Remember that was a big theme 20 years ago, but that seems to have fallen by the wayside. I know General Peddle, when he came to office, he kind of was leery of the kind of warning on the forecast that, the Christian message, Christianity in general, is not all that well received in parts of the world. So I'm not sure how possible revival is, but wouldn't it be great?
Oh, yeah. I think revival is always possible. But what I said about Christian publishing, I think, is true of the church, and by extension, the army as well, is that I think the church is in a time of transition also. And, the Salvation Army comes out of that great 19th century and early 20th century revivalist tradition, of tent meetings and camp meetings and those sorts of things. And I don't necessarily think that, just because of the way the culture has changed, I suspect that's not how revival comes in the 21st century. But I think, because revival by its nature is a groundswell, I think that so much depends on seeing where the Spirit is working and enlisting in that work. And so as more and more people see the work of the Spirit across this strange landscape that we have in the 21st century, I think revival is not only possible, I think it has to come. But it's just a question of timing, of when and through whom and through what.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Well, Bob, we really thank you for spending a few moments, and we hope that you'll join us again down the road. And thank you on behalf of all of our readers for what you're contributing to current issues of the War Cry, and what you've done for the Salvation Army literary world in the past, and what you've done for Christendom with your work, obviously in the past with Josh McDowell, what you're doing now as a literary agent. And we hope that we can continue to support you, and we'll pray for you, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you. It's been such a joy, as always.
Well, that's going to end this episode of the Fight for Good podcast. Be sure to subscribe to Fight for Good wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to follow the War Cry and Peer Magazine on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Pinterest. Until next time, this has been the Fight for Good podcast. Bye for now.
Subscribe to Fight for Good wherever you listen to podcasts.